6 months ago, I put my money where my mouth is. I gave up the RTX lifestyle and switched to Radeon, selling my mangy old 8GB RTX 3070 and upgrading to an equally old 16GB RX 6900 XT. I knew at the time I was making a compromise. I was gaining a more powerful GPU with lower driver overhead that would be harder to bottleneck in my CPU reviews, and that wouldn't run out of VRAM in modern games. But giving up access to fancy pants DLSS upscaling and ray reconstruction. So, half a year later, do I regret it? Let's recap for those who missed the first video or have just forgotten. In the first half of 2023, a bunch of games were released that felt tailor-made to make older GPUs obsolete. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't think the devs of The Last of Us collaborated with Nvidia and AMD to convince people to sell their 4 to 8GB graphics cards, but, well, that's pretty much what happened. The new series of games, with system requirements centered around the specs of a PS5 or Xbox Series X, left higher performing 8GB cards like the RTX 3070 in a weird place. Still perfectly capable of running low and medium at 100 FPS or more, but basically incapable of smooth experiences at higher quality settings. A lot of people will say, so what? Last year's games were terrible. Who cares if they played poorly on 8GB GPUs, just play older ones instead. You're always complaining about how your backlog keeps getting longer. To that, I say, first, I disagree. There were some great games hiding behind poorly optimised ports last year. Second, how dare you be so accurate about my backlog? And third, this is my job. I mean, I could make content just for people who want to know how old hardware performs in old games, and while that might be interesting for some, I think those YouTube videos have already been made, back when there were new games and new hardware. There's no shortage of content on how the i7-8700K runs GTA 5, but someone looking to maintain a Z370 platform in 2024 might want to know how it performs in games made this decade. Anyway, it's too late to argue now. The decision was made 6 months ago. I sold my RTX and switched to the red side, knowing full well what I was getting into and that my brand switching experience probably wouldn't be uniformly good. But was it bad? And am I switching back? Naturally, as my channel is mostly about PC gaming, you'll want to hear about my experience playing games. Well, to tell you the truth, when I realised the 6-month anniversary was coming up, I panicked, like a kid who hasn't done their homework. I've done almost no gaming for fun since December, maybe. I've been busy for the last few months with the channel, to the point where I spend my downtime just lazing on the couch more than anything. I considered putting this video back and making it 1 year later, but rather than take the coward's way out, I decided to cram. To that end, I've played a bunch of games from my backlog, at least an hour in each, to get a feel for how the RX 6900 XT performs in games I actually want to play. Let's start with the game I've been afraid to play for about a year now. Star Wars Jedi Survivor was my most eagerly anticipated release of 2023. I loved the first game, Fallen Order, and I was initially concerned that putting Survivor on my benchmark roster would get me into the standard benchmarker's rut, playing the same 3-minute section over and over again until the end of time, and never actually getting to experience the game. As it turns out, I should have been far more concerned about the game's performance. Now, having played through Fallen Order twice, I'm aware that Respawn's Star Wars games have a tendency to stutter, but that game mostly lived or died by whether it was on a hard drive or SSD, and as a Flash aficionado, I obviously played it from a solid state drive and had fairly little to complain about. Survivor started life extremely poorly, being overly demanding on both the GPU and CPU, and lacking much in the way of updates since just a couple of months after launch. My personal editing/gaming rig currently has a Ryzen 7 5700X, which has 2 more cores than the recommended AMD CPU, and 32GB of RAM, double the recommended amount, so, at least according to Respawn, I shouldn't have any problem running their game. The intro video tells you about all you need to know about that. Respawn should be ashamed to see a system this far above the recommended spec having difficulty getting through their logo without intolerable amounts of stutter. Anyway, before I restarted the game from scratch, I ran a couple of my usual tests in Kobo to get a feel for how it performed. At 1440 Epic, I could see frame rates appearing to be hovering in the 70s, though of course there was still plenty of stutter, so I imagine 1% lows would have been a fair way below the 60 mark. I did really want to play the game with ray tracing, so I gave it a try at 1440 high with FSR quality and RT enabled, and the baseline frame rates appeared to drop to about the 60 mark, but fluctuated into the 50s and 40s quite frequently. I thought this would have been pretty acceptable for a single-player title, but nevertheless, I did a bit of tweaking in MSI Afterburner to the core and VRAM clocks before I started a new game. The early stages on Coruscant were about what I expected, with the abundance of metal and neon providing an RT enthusiast's dream, but an RDNA 2 card's nightmare. Frame rates bounced around between 60 and 70, but still dropped into the 40s and even the 30s in cutscenes. Even turning back to my non-RT settings, which could run well into the 80s during regular gameplay, took a sharp nosedive when the cinematics started playing. Things really fell apart in the first boss fight with the Ninth Sister. There's a ton of particles, volumetrics and alpha effects in this fight, and the 6900 XT simply couldn't handle it, even without RT. Frame rates dropped into the teens at times, and spent most of the time around the cinematic 24 mark. On Kobo, I found I could play happily at 1440 high with RT enabled and FSR balanced, which didn't look too bad on the whole, but which maintained a pretty playable frame rates most of the time. I'm going to spend some more time tinkering with this one to see if I can find any combination of settings that helps improve performance. I do really want to play this game, but I think I have to accept it's not getting much better than this. Last time I talked about my personal rig, I expressed a desire to play more Death Stranding, and it's been 2 years and that still hasn't happened yet. I know it's a polarising game, and I can't say I'm particularly a fan of Kojima's work or Norman Reedus as an actor, but what attracts me to the game is what I can only describe as vibes. The Iceland-inspired landscape, the chill music, and character models that are so good you almost forget it's a PS4 game. Yes, it's the director's cut with some current-gen enhancements, but if this had been made today and looked exactly the same as it does now, I'd be equally impressed. Except I can't help but feel like if it were made today, then it wouldn't run anywhere nearly as well. Uncapped at 1440 max settings, frame rates are in the high refresh territory, and if it weren't for my capture card limiting me to a 60Hz refresh rate, I think I'd be able to happily play at 144, or maybe 120 to be on the safe side. I did learn the value of VSync, however. Even in cutscenes where the frame rate limits itself to 60, there were significant and distracting amounts of tearing. Enabling VSync caps gameplay to 60 as well, removes the distracting tearing, and GPU utilization is under 50% pretty much the whole time. I also noticed that, despite the general stellar image quality, shadow resolution isn't the highest, and this can cause some slight flickering at times. Obviously a remnant of its PS4 origins, but it'll be nice to see some ray-traced shadows added. FromSoft's critical and commercial blockbuster Elden Ring is, I admit, a game I've struggled to get into. I don't know if I'm just intimidated by its reputation for treating noobs unfairly, or if I just need a game to hold my hand a little more in order to feel like I'm doing the right things, but I've never really given it a chance. Well, from a performance level, I was not impressed at first. I'm used to the game being fairly easy on higher end hardware due to the presence of a 60 FPS cap, but since I last played it, FromSoft have added ray tracing, and given how trivial the game would be for the 6900 XT to run otherwise, it made sense to give RT a try. What they haven't added is any form of advanced upscaling, and changing resolution at all sometimes involves a fair amount of dicking around. At full 1440p max quality with max RT, the frame rate was only in the 30s and 40s, so I dropped both quality and RT to high to get back up to the 60 mark. This was mostly fine, both indoors and outdoors, with the frametime graph only spiking a small amount from time to time. However, it did drop into the 40s when I reached this particular area. This struck me as weird, as there is a lake here, but I don't think Elden Ring's reflections use ray tracing, so I can't quite explain what it was about this area that was so demanding on the system. Anyway, I tried butting my head against a couple of brick walls early on, before deciding my time was better spent elsewhere. Maybe I'll return to Elden Ring in the future, when I'm not on a deadline. I got about halfway through Control a few years back, around the time I started taking YouTube seriously, but I didn't finish. When I returned to it a few months after putting it down, I'd forgotten too much. What the mission involved, what all the controls were, what exactly was going on in the story, so for this video I started from scratch. 1440 high with RT enabled was a little short of the 60 mark, and I know that at times it can drop even further, so I used FSR with a render resolution of 1080p. The game looks pretty grainy with RT enabled anyway. It's a prime candidate for Nvidia's ray reconstruction or some other kind of AI noise reduction technique, and while FSR doesn't help, it also doesn't look much worse. Plus, the RT effects look spectacular, with the wood veneer, tile floors and metallic surfaces having a convincing amount of roughness, and glass reflects realistically, though I did get a little confused by the lack of reflections from these ceiling lights, especially as it's also the same in the pre-rendered cutscene. Weird. Anyway, FPS was well above 60 most of the time, so I enabled the limiter to minimise tearing, and had a blast. Remedy really needs to work on a Jedi or Sith game, because a lot of Jesse's powers would be great in a Star Wars context. In a moment of either blinding clarity or blind stupidity, I cancelled my Game Pass sub last year, abandoning dozens of hours of progress in Forza Horizon 5 in the process. I'd got tired of Microsoft's terrible launcher and its tendency to uninstall games when moving drives between systems, or get permanently stuck when downloading an update, so I bought it on Steam. Even though you still need to log into your Microsoft account to play, your progress doesn't cross over, so I had to start building my car collection all over again. Unfortunately, beyond using it as a benchmarking tool, I really struggle in returning to Horizon right now. Anyway, my ISP gave me a free Game Pass sub, just in time for Forza Motorsport, and I find myself on the verge of making the same mistake. I don't want to spend money on a game that's had a lukewarm critical reception, is hated by series fans, and makes the somewhat poorly received Gran Turismo 7 look awesome by comparison. On the other hand, I'm kind of enjoying myself, but I don't want to get too far into it lest I end up buying it on Steam again. Although I'm a self-confessed RT fan, I don't care so much about it in the context of racing games, especially ones where I don't really have time to stop and appreciate the view. If you're laser focused on your racing line and braking point, I don't really see the benefits of accurate lighting, shadows and reflections. At 1440p with the other quality settings maxed out, and as many dynamic quality options as I could find turned off, the canned benchmark showed an average of 92 FPS, which would be perfectly acceptable for me. My monitor's FreeSync range caps out at 90Hz. Again, due to the capture device, I was stuck at 60 with a limiter to avoid tearing, and while races were mostly pain-free, the intro cinematics were stuttery as all hell. Again, I suspect this is more of a programming problem than a hardware issue, as Forza Motorsport hasn't had the best of starts, and I think a lot of the post-launch period was spent fixing flying cars and more memeable problems. Am I gonna stick with it? I don't know. I was kind of hoping Gran Turismo would be ported to PC, and with rumours that PSVR 2 is coming to PC, that could be a pretty sweet combo. Maybe I'll stick with Forza Horizon for the time being and get the Polyphony title, if it ever makes it across the platform divide. In the last video, Phantom Liberty had yet to be released, and I'd pretty much made peace with the fact that my new graphics card wouldn't be able to handle path tracing and wouldn't support ray reconstruction either. I'd accepted that, but maybe not fully. I spent a bit of time before heading over to Dogtown just trying out RT settings. Path tracing looked fine, but with balanced upscaling it was kinda soft, and that still only managed a pretty uneven 24 FPS. The RT Ultra preset could manage high 30s to low 50s with quality upscaling, so it looked a bit smoother and sharper, but still didn't quite meet my requirements. Granted, I wasn't making life easy on myself, but I was finding it a bit tough to drive at this frame rate. A solid 60 would have required dropping to RT Medium, losing out on reflections, and balanced upscaling at best, so I did what I should have done all along and turned RT off. Starting the Phantom Liberty expansion at the Dogtown checkpoint, I'm running at native 1440 Ultra and seeing 70 plus FPS, even as high as 100 in some scenes. But with the capture device plugged in, I'm seeing a ton of tearing, so I turned on a frame rate cap in RTSS. I will definitely be spending some more time going through this expansion, not least because they've introduced new mechanics and skill trees, and my character feels a bit weaker than the last time I played. Plus, I haven't met Idris yet. Finally, I have Nick, one of my subscribers, to thank for my copy of Baldur's Gate 3, a game which I've yet to feature in my YouTube videos because I actually wanted to play it. I was borderline obsessed with BG 1 and 2 in the early 2000s, and while my interest in the Sword Coast fell off before Neverwinter Nights even came out, the hype around BG 3 caught my interest. Thankfully, it's pretty much zero challenge for the 6900 XT. Nvidia sponsorship or not, this game can happily run at 1440 maxed out at over 150 FPS. And while I haven't reached the city yet, I'm confident my CPU won't cause too many problems. I re-rolled for this video, but I admit I really wanted to spend more time with a character creator. My new Bard is pretty much the default high elf option with a different haircut. I have no complaints about the graphics in this one. Yes, without RT there are a few flaws in the lighting and ambient occlusion, but given the size of the game and the small team behind it, I think it looks incredible. Plus, the last Baldur's Gate game I played was at like 1024 by 768. The reality is, though, that my RX 6900 XT doesn't get used for gaming all that much. Look, I had to literally set aside a week and force myself to play games on it for this video. This is a workstation PC, and what really matters is how it performs in my video editing package of choice, Blackmagic Design's Davinci Resolve. Like most creative software, Resolve is built primarily around Nvidia's CUDA acceleration, and while Radeons are supported, they've never been highly recommended. Now that I have a Radeon installed, I can say that I've had a few issues, but at the moment it's actually all working out pretty well. When I first installed the card, I had problems with layers and transitions, causing huge slowdowns when playing back and scrubbing through footage on the timeline. But dealing with that has taught me to be more careful how I edit, now that I've optimised my workflow, making sure everything I edit is on an SSD, taking better care of my caches, and ensuring all the files I use are in codecs which the GPU can handle. Performance is now dramatically improved. Of course, this could just be me trying to cope with my inferior graphics card purchase, so I decided to do a sanity check. I happen to have an RTX 2080 Ti on hand. Review coming soon. So I DDU'd my Radeon drivers and swapped out the 6900 XT for the old Turing card. The 2080 Ti's 4th gen NV deck is one generation behind the state of the art, so perhaps I shouldn't expect too much. And indeed, timeline performance is about the same as the Radeon, scrubbing through with only the slightest of delays, playing back at an almost perfect 60 FPS, and rendering out the test file at the slow preset completed in about the same time. Though the very slow preset did take about twice as long for no apparent benefit. Wrapping things up, there's a few questions to be answered. Firstly, did I have any problems? In a word, no. I don't want to dismiss the accounts of people who've had major driver issues with Radeon GPUs. I know TechNotice abandoned the idea of using the 7900 XT in an editing rig because it made Premiere Pro mysteriously shut down. I'm not saying people don't have genuine problems with AMD GPUs, but I am saying that in 6 months of using it in Davinci Resolve, benchmarking CPUs, and maybe a dozen or so total hours of gaming for this video, I haven't experienced any of the negatives people talk about. Am I satisfied with my GPU? Well, no, frankly. Of course not. I want an RTX 4090, or being more realistic, maybe a 4080 Super. Doesn't everyone? Unless you have some ideological reason to hate one giant semi-evil corporation over the others, you'd spend a small amount of your lottery win buying the best GPU available at the time. And right now, if money isn't an issue, then the card in question is a Geforce. But of course, money is an issue. I run a small YouTube channel in a niche with a relatively low CPM, and the only sponsorships I've accepted so far just send me free review samples of mini PCs. I'm not rolling in money is what I'm saying. 5 years ago, hell, even 3 years ago, I wouldn't have dreamed of spending £525 on a graphics card. And even now I need to justify it as a work expense because if it weren't for the channel, I'd be more interested in something like this old RTX 2080 Ti. Seriously, I got this thing for £277, and although the Gigabyte cooler's a bit noisy, it's a cracking deal for the price. The point is, I'm used to not having the best of everything. I can't run RT in a lot of more demanding games without dropping substantially below 60 FPS, and I'd rather have the frames. If I do use RT, I'm kinda stuck with FSR and XeSS instead of something more advanced like DLSS. And while I'm looking forward to the new AI-powered upscaler that AMD's been teasing recently, I'm also aware that it might not come to this generation of product. As it is, I'm happy with the level of performance I get from the 6900 XT in most modern games. And if developers would kindly get their shit together, I could probably make this thing last for a while longer. However, that brings me to the next question. Am I keeping it? That's a question I can't quite answer. The rationale for owning a Radeon hasn't changed. I still want to test a bunch of older CPUs in the coming months. I want to revisit some earlier Ryzens, some HEDT Xeons, i7s and i9s from the Socket 2011 V3 and 2066 days, as well as some more humble 2 and 4 core chips. As I found last year, driver overhead is a real problem for older CPUs, and that means to get the most out of them, Radeon remains the best choice. It doesn't mean, however, that it has to be this Radeon. I have 2 projects in mind, one requiring the RX 7900 GRE and one requiring the RX 7800 XT. The 7900 GRE has the same SM, TMU and ROP count as the 6900 XT, and so I'd expect the only real-world benefit would be to gain AV1 encoding, whereas the 7800 XT wouldn't be an unambiguous winner against my existing card and may actually be a small downgrade, but the video idea is more interesting. All of which leaves me with just one final question to answer. You, dear viewer, should you do what I did and switch to AMD? Well, that depends. I assume you have a graphics card already and are in some way tied to the green team. If you can get better value from an AMD, I wouldn't let the naysayers put you off. Just make sure to use something like DDU to remove your Nvidia drivers first, or better yet, do a full fresh install of Windows. On the other hand, if you're looking with an eye towards creative work, especially with Adobe Suite or anything that uses CUDA acceleration, then Nvidia is still really the only game in town. Especially as it looks like Zaluda isn't going to be a widespread thing anymore. Meanwhile, if I can find time, I'm going to play some more Jedi Survivor, stutters and all. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.